Hello, welcome to the EF4 Standup. We're back for another great session. This week we have Julie Lerman, who we will talk to you later. We'll be doing anything. So we're basically going to be taking your questions for Julie. Before we do that, let's go to, also we have Jeremy here, Shai from the EF team, and Eric EJ, who's our regular community SQL Server expert who likes to join us. So thank you for those people. Let's go to the state of the unicorn. If I can get this right. Okay, so what's going on right now? Well, EF Core 6.0 Preview 2 any day now. We do these about monthly. It's already been about a month from Preview 1. There isn't that much in Preview. I think the blog that Jeremy I've been working on has like 4 features that we talk about, little features that are nice but not big. Mostly because we're working on big stuff that isn't really visible yet at the exposed features level, shall we say. So some of that work is the compiled model. So Andrea is working very hard on the compiled model. And there's a PR, I think yesterday or the day before, came out with an optimized runtime model. So previously in EF Core, the model that you built in model building was the same model that you used when you were actually running your application, and now we have an optimized runtime model that allows that to be faster for basically reading stuff as opposed to building the model. So that's the first part of compiled models, or one part of compiled models. Likewise, there's a Submit just sent a PR out for improving in memory, and I wanted to show you this because this PR resolves this many in-memory query issues. So this is a major thing from Smith to get the in-memory stuff working, and greatly appreciated because you guys all love the in-memory despite the team trying to get me to cancel it and everything the whole time. So yeah.
and Jimmy Bogard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Shai's still working on Tech Empower Perf. I think most people probably saw last week we got pretty close to or we got a lot closer to Dapper. There's some other optimizations that Shai's been working on that we've been arguing about, but look like they're going to get us even closer there. At which point we may start looking at some of the update pipeline perf and things like that. But it's looking pretty good on the query stuff. And then finally, our doc of the week this week is a very simple one. It's the introduction to the DB context lifetime configuration and initialization. So let me quickly switch to that. So this is basically everything about using no, I don't need you to tell me stuff, Edge. Everything about using a unit of work. So there's a quote here from Mark and Fowler about what a unit of work is. And I think people who have had me respond to their issues on GitHub will know I go on and on about use a single context for a single unit of work, and it will work much better if you do it that way. So this talks about that, and then it tells you how to basically set it up with the compounds for dependency injection, using new to create a DB context instance. You don't have to use DI. We designed it so you can easily just do, you can just new up a context instance. And then we've added section here for factories because we have a DB context factory now where you can add a factory to DI and then resolve context from that. And that's very useful in Blazor, but also other places. Down here, we talk a bit more about what's in DB context options and what it does. So for example, something that people tend to miss is that on configuring is always called, even if you use add DB context. So you can put common configuration or you can tweak configuration in on configuring, even if you're using add DB context to do most of your configuration. Stuff about the database provider, and then we have links to the most common ones, plus also there's our full link to all of the database providers here. And then here we have just this is a good way to find out additional configuration that you can do when you're doing on configuring or add DB context. So, the query tracking behavior can be set default. We have the logging methods and logging configuration, interceptors, and then using proxies, for example. So these are some of the other things you can do on the options builder. So take a look at that for everything around DB context initialization and its lifetime and how to manage it. And there's probably going to be some more coming under this section when I get time to do it. So with that, let's go look at the show links for this week. Jeremy, do you want to talk through this? Oh. Okay, so, well, it looks like, I'll go. It looks like we have a link to the document I just showed. So this is the doc of the week. And then we basically, since this is a Julie Lerman Ask Me Anything, these are all Julie links.
Julie.
So if you want to find out where she's posting and what she's doing, then go to our show links. Okay, so shall we move on to Ask Julie Anything? I think we're ready, right?
Okay. I'm ready.
Okay, so
what are you gonna ask me?
All right, we'll queue it up. While we're waiting for the first question to come through, I had a question for you. I actually have several questions, but we'll defer to the live community, who I'm sure are bringing lots of them. But can you tell us how you became interested in programming? What got that started for you?
Oh, well, that'll take up the hour. We'll be fine. Well, in college, many years ago, there was a programming class. I think it was basic on Heathkits that the math teachers had built. So I was already nerdy. So I was curious about it. Pardon me?
What was your major in college?
I was a history major. And I was doing a lot of art studio.
Oh, super cool. I didn't know that.
History major, art studio,
I'm also a history guy.
Literature. I wanted to get into the filmmaking industry and right? So
well, we're making movies together right
now. Here we go.
And today you're famous. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just had a knack for it, right? It wasn't like smarter than the others. It was just, your brain works that way. And it was just kind of clear in a large class. There was a few of us that got good grades and everybody else was like D's. Right. And it wasn't about smart and not smart. Everybody there was brilliant, but just in different ways, what turns your brain on. So that was really kind of my hook, although I was just like, yeah, whatever, went back to the art studio. And then when I moved to New York after I graduated, and I was at a company, you probably all know this by now. I was at a company called Penthouse Corporation. Not a shock anymore. Anyway, I was working for the guy who was like the head of accounting or something. There was 1,000 people in the company. He had the computer on his desk, and within a couple of weeks, it was on my desk because I was like, "Oh yeah, I'll figure this out. I'll figure that out." So it's just on from there.
Nice,
awesome,
very cool. We've got some questions coming in. Let me take them in sequence. This one's probably more for the team in general. Is there an easy to follow doc for porting an EF6 project to .NET 5 and EF Core? And Arthur has.
So I'm just going to be honest here. No, there isn't. I think Jimmy Bogart posted a tweet 6 months or so ago where he did how to draw an owl, and it's like you do an oval, and then the next one is like, that's your full owl. It's like, okay, where do I go from my oval to my full owl? That's what our docs are like for porting from EF6 at the moment. That being said, a lot of people have had success with basically just taking stuff over and then running tests or figuring out what's working and what isn't doing. It can be challenging, but it depends on what features you're using in EF6 and what your model looks like and those kinds of things. For a lot of applications, it really isn't challenging at all. A lot of applications, you just take it over, change a few syntax things, rebuild, and it will work. But it's a very fair point to say that we don't have good docs for that at the moment. So that was supposed to be asked Julie, but it was asked me.
Some advice about that, though, right? About how to approach it, rather than, not just like there are syntax changes and behavior changes.
We need better docs, yes.
Well, I'm not saying that about the docs. I'm saying here we are. We can talk about that a little bit.
Yes, yeah, we can.
And one of the things I've often told people, or as working with clients, is there's some good prep work you can do, like refactoring or whatever. If you've got a big application, it might be helpful to refactor it and break things down into smaller parts so that, you can take one piece and shift that over without affecting the rest of it, right? You learn while you're doing that, or you can do testing and things like that. And also you can really, it's really helpful to identify what's important to move over, right? If stuff is just working and you never seem to have to touch the code, just leave it alone. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? First, don't fix it first.
Well, that's a very good point, and I think relates to also that EF6 runs on .NET Core. So you don't have to port to EF Core at the same time as you're porting everything else to .NET Core. You can port to .NET Core, leave EF6 in there. It will still work on .NET Core. And then, like Julie says, if you're not changing it, just leave it. I mean, if EF6 is working and it's code that you're not going to modify very much, then just leave EF6 in there. If you're going to move this application forward, then I would say go through and port to EF Core so that you can start taking advantage of new features and things like that. But probably if it's not going to change very much, just leave it as EF6 running on .NET Core until you need to do something.
Right, but I also think a really important piece of that advice is if you can identify the stuff that you really do work on a lot, or something that you really want to take advantage of, new features.
Yeah.
To really look and see how you can isolate that with refactoring, if needed. Maybe it already is, its own small unit, right? But I think that's a really important, maybe first step to do, to try to isolate things you want to change and just do a little bit at a time.
Yep.
Yeah, I like that. The notion a lot of people have is it's all or nothing, right? And the whole thing's converted or not. And sometimes the way apps are written, you're kind of stuck with that. But I think a lot of times, to your point, Julie, there's the opportunity to break off a piece of it, even if it's not broken out now, right? You can pull it out and stop using the legacy piece for that. Okay, here's one specifically for Julie, and that is, do you get rid of AutoMapper if you're using domain-driven development?
It probably means domain-driven design.
Design, sorry.
That's okay.
But
my previous answer was DDD thinking also, right? Just breaking big problems down into small problems. So first of all, I don't use AutoMapper. No reason. There's no real reason. It's just I've always, done what I have done. So I've never been in the situation of replacing AutoMapper. However, I don't see that as related to domain-driven design. I mean, the interesting thing about having AutoMapper is it lets you really think about, we've got our domain problems that we're solving. And then over here, we have our persistence problems. And then we're using AutoMapper as kind of the connection between them. So that's a really beneficial thing. Now, as EF Core has gotten smarter and smarter about, or more flexible about, being able to handle a lot of the mappings that result from the way we design our domain models. I've I've seen less and less need for an auto mapper. Right. And letting EF core becomes a mapper, and that's a really interesting thing. When I talk to people about Entity Framework or EF core and domain driven design, they're like, well, you can't persist your domain models directly. And I have to kind of explain it in a way that they can see that what Entity Framework is doing is creating that mapper. It is the mapper. And people kind of don't get that. They think that you're just connecting directly. I'm like, no, you're not. Actually, EF core is the mapper. There are still things that you might hit that it doesn't map the way you want it to or as easily, but there's, that list is just getting smaller every time.
I think that point that you make there, Julie, is like critical. And it really comes down to, are you mapping your domain objects to entities? And if you are, then AutoMapper is probably not the right thing for you, because you're going to be querying out of EF directly into your domain objects, which you then manipulate because they are your domain objects. AutoMapper is a kind of used in a slightly different approach, like Julie mentioned, where you're saying, I'm going to query for a bunch of stuff from the database, and it's going to be a fairly anemic model. It's going to basically map fairly one-to-one with the database very often. And then I'm going to project those out to DTOs, which are not, in fact, my entities at all. And I'm going to, those DTOs may be my business object, but often they're actual data transfer objects, which just go over the wire and then are used on the client side to build up more complex UI or whatever. So it's kind of like a different approach, whether or not you're saying, I'm going to query and then I'm going to project to DTOs, or whether or not you're going to do the DDD thing, which is basically using your domain objects directly with EF. And of course, you could write DDD objects and have a mapping from other objects to the DDD objects, but most people using DDD with EF core, at least what I've seen, don't do that. And they just, like Julie says, they map directly and use EF as the mapping thing, and AutoMapper then is really not needed. I think Shai was wanting to say something.
Yeah, there's just one point. If you are thinking about introducing this additional layer of mapping from your EF core entity or types or whatever you want to call them using AutoMapper, you have to be aware of it. For example, there are certain situations when you want to update, when you use the unit of work kind of pattern with EF core, you're basically loading something from the database, manipulating it, and then telling EF core, okay, now persist these changes to the database. If the things that you loaded, you are now going to map to yet other objects, and then you're going to do your modifications on those objects, EF core has no way of knowing that you've done this. So this approach basically interferes with the way EF core manages change tracking, or let's call it unit of work in general. It doesn't mean that you can't do it, and there's definitely means to get this to work. You have to do some manual work, but you have to be aware of it. So using any sort of additional mapping layer, be it AutoMapper or something else, could complicate things a little bit. You just have to be aware of it.
Cool. Working down the list, we've got this one. Do I have to use the DB context factory to dynamically change the connection string?
No. But the answer all depends on what it means to dynamically change,
right?
So in EF Core 5.0, we actually made it so that any point on the DB context, you can go to a DB context database and change the DB connection. You can set a different DB connection, or you can change the connection string. And that didn't used to work, but we've added that in 5.0. So it allows you to basically mutate the connection at any time. Now, I say at any time, not when it's open, not when the connection is open and we're actually doing something, because ADO.NET doesn't allow that. But if you've done a query, you could then change the connection and do an update and send it to a different database. So in a kind of CQRS kind of pattern, you can query from one database and then update to another just by setting the property on the database now. So hopefully that answers that, even though it wasn't Julie answering.
Thank you.
All right, let's look at this one. Using database first approach, what's the best way to write validation without touching the models?
Fluent validation.
There we go. Eric with the answer.
That's an Eric question for sure. Do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, EF Core doesn't really support a validation. EF6 did, but it's not part of EF Core. And Fluent validation works really well. And in particular, if you're doing an API, it really helps you a lot. It serves human readable error messages just by doing some coding. So it's an excellent tool for doing validation, and it's also validating at a very early stage in the request pipeline. So you don't have to interfere with traffic to the database in order to validate that what is posted to you is useful.
Okay, everybody
Sorry,
stop.
am I distracting
Everybody
people?
stop now.
You're distracted.
Cat time.
Everybody look at
Sorry.
Arthur's cats. I guess I'm going to add one thing. So another way to interpret that question, because this was about database first, is to do your validation in the database. I'm assuming that that's not what was meant, but it could be, maybe. So I'm just going to remind people that there's this thing called check constraints, which allow you to basically represent arbitrary, validation for database rows. So you can express whatever you want as a SQL expression. You can do this with a database first approach. You can also do this with a code first approach. So EF Core fully supports specifying check constraints, and there is even like an unofficial plugin that we have called efcore.checkConstraints that allows you to apply various common types of check constraints. Anyway, check constraints are a cool thing, and I think very, very often overlooked.
I agree with what Shai said. However, I'll put a caveat with that. If you do your validation at the database level, you're likely to end up just with errors that are difficult to recover from. In fact, even interpret. We had the session recently about getting standardized kind of information out of error exception messages, right? Georgie came in and presented that. And that's one way of doing it, but using the Fluent validator and validating, basically, in the way I see it, and this is just my opinion, do what you feel best, but in my opinion, using check constraints and everything in the database is great as a check, as a programmer application level validation that your application is working correctly. But you need a different kind of validation that acts at both your user interface and at the request level at least, to do proper application domain validation and give appropriate messages to your user. EF doesn't do that for you, and if you try and use EF for things like required attributes, or it won't save a required, you'll again get into it's similar to the database situation where you basically get an unrecoverable, effectively, error that you have to then restart from. So check constraints in the database so that you make sure your data remains consistent. Nothing in EF because the database is doing it, and at the request level and the UI level it's validating. That's why we don't have validation in EF. Request level validation, UI validation, request level validation, because you can't rely on the UI, right? Because man in the middle and all that kind of stuff. And EF has nothing, and then the database has its constraints to make sure that the database stays consistent. That's the way I see it.
I remember when we had validation in EF, and it was, it was like last minute check before you send stuff to the database.
Yeah.
Right. Remember that API? Yeah. And it was just like, oh, okay, if we're supposed to use that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that principle of
well,
least
it's interesting
trust.
because lots of people asked us. Yeah. It's interesting that back in the EF4 days, I can't remember what it was, but around EF4, a lot of people were asking for validation, and so I think in .NET 4.5 and EF5 we put in validation. And Diego and I did some work on that at the time, and at the time we were really questioning, is this really valuable? But so many people were demanding it that we have to do this. And then I think when we started EFK, we looked back at that and said, given what I just outlined as the way we see validation, it really doesn't make sense for us to put resources into putting this validation into EF Core.
And has anybody bothered asking about that since? Right. Right.
Yeah, people ask, and then. But people are pretty generally happy with the answer that you really should do it other places. When people get that, I think I think it makes sense. And so, yes, people ask for it, but not in a way that they just are pedantically needing to do it in EF layer.
Awesome. Let's come down to a great topic, migrations, and something that everyone has to deal with using them, migrations in production, right? And I would like to have them executed as soon as the app service comes up. Recommended via SQL script seems too manual for me.
I happen to have, for my Docker stuff that I'm doing tomorrow at the community event, I happen to have a solution sitting in Visual Studio open on my other screen that has a way of doing that. What I do, and this is leveraging containers, of course, I actually let Entity Framework migrations create the SQL. And then I take the SQL and I, fix it up a little bit, and I feed it to Flyway. And I have, so Flyway DB. And I have a Flyway DB container. So I've got, and I'm sorry for, people who are new or have not done containers and Docker and orchestration. I actually, maybe we'll add links. I have on a couple of sessions I've done on doing that, on putting that together. But what happens with the orchestration is once so I've got a database in a container, which you don't have to do for production, but for testing and CI/CD and everything, it's nice to have in the container. But once the database is available, the database server and the database are available, I spin it. The orchestrator spins up Flyway, and Flyway applies all of the different SQL files because maybe I did one, and then I did some seeding, and then I did some changes. So I have them just like with migrations, right, in kind of in their order. So it's another way of doing migrations, but it's so cool because it just triggers, it does its work, and then Flyway container shuts down, and then the app spins up, the app container spins up, and everything's all ready to go. So I really like that mechanism, although it's not asking Entity Framework to solve every single problem.
Are you not doing?
No, I think Eric should go.
Are you not doing some work with EF6 to improve that experience? I think Bryce is working on something.
Yeah, in EF Core 6, we are working on a feature called migration bundles, which is conceptually very similar to what Julie is saying, which is actually very similar to the guidance, like use scripts, right? But the idea of the migration bundle is that it, rather than you having to deal with the SQL script, you have essentially a little deployable executable or something similar to that, where you give it a connection string, and then it essentially runs migrations and updates the database for you, rather than you having to go through the scripting and stuff yourself. But conceptually, it's the same thing. The key is migrating your database is a deployment time activity, not a application startup activity. So when you deploy a new application, if you have a way of doing that without bringing your system down, then great. Or if you have a service window, which is more normal, then bring down your application and update your database in as a deployment step of that window and start everything up again. Don't just try and have the first user who hits it as a user then go and do part of your deployment. That seems like a really bad idea to us. Experience has shown it is pretty bad.
If you're running your app in multiple containers and they're all doing that. So I remember, Eric, when you guys were initially working on this sometime last year with some different experiments and and I just don't get involved in that kind of stuff. So, I'm like, oh, Docker, let me do it that way.
Okay, this one's a little more generic. Is there a document site that you can recommend that compares performance EF6 versus EF Core? In our published benchmarks, do we benchmark EF6 at all, or is it just EF Core?
It's just EF.
Franz?
Just EF
Is
core.
Ron still doing it with his big benchmark thing?
Maybe.
Franz
I haven't
Roma?
looked recently. He might be.
Yeah. Is that's probably the best source, and it's
So-
updated in the RepoDB repository. He continuously updates so he can compare with everything else.
Do you know, is there a link or a site we can?
Here it is.
Yeah.
The .NET Micro ORM fetch benchmark results and the fine details. Oh, except that last one is from 2017.
It's an Access Bencher. Let me just look in RepoDB.
Okay, we'll
What is that?
post
Oh, here.
We'll find
post
some
that
links.
in when we find it.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting one. Is EF suitable for desktop applications with local storage, or is an underlying relational database a requirement? And the answer is an underlying database is a requirement. Doesn't have to be relational, because it could be Azure Cosmos DB, which is not relational, but we don't have a provider for local storage.
Correct. But we do have SQLite. So a lot of people will use SQLite for local data storage and then map to EF with it, both in terms of desktop applications and mobile applications. We're working to make that faster, as always, on mobile applications, which have challenges in terms of things like AOT and stuff like that. But yeah, SQLite is a reasonable local database.
SQL CE provider. SQL CE provider.
Yeah.
SQL
And this is not
Compact
about Corona.
out
That's
of
not a Corona.
support, or
It's a little bit dead in the water. Yeah.
And for those of you who don't know why
don't use
I'm
SQL CE.
doing that, Eric has been writing the SQL
Yeah.
CE provider for
Many,
quite a while.
many years ago. Yes.
And then the
Oh,
Postgres.
fun.
Yeah.
And when we got them all here, not all, but
All right, well, let
provider.
me ask. I'm still sorting through. We have some more questions queued up, but I have another question for you, Julie. How did you find Entity Framework? What was your introduction to it, and how did that sort of hook you to the point where that's such a large part of your career?
I can answer that question. In 2006 at TechEd, remember the precursor, the Microsoft TechEd, in Boston, I was invited to a small room with just a few people there to see this ORM that the data, it was the SQL Server team at the time. It had come out of Microsoft Research, and the ADO.NET team was working on evolving it, and it is what eventually became Entity Framework. Now, it wasn't the first ORM out there by any means, and it wasn't Microsoft's first ORM. And by the way, Link to SQL was also being worked on, but the data people and the C# people kind of hadn't shared that with each other, so that's a whole nother story. But it was the first time I had seen an ORM and used an ORM. So I definitely got pretty excited about it and interested. And then the funny thing was that because this was Microsoft's, not including Link to SQL, Microsoft's third try at an ORM, everybody who kind of was more familiar with ORMs were like, it's not going to happen. Come on, they've already tried twice. They're not going to release it. I'm like, yeah, but this is fun. And everything I was doing, and nothing was documented. Nobody knew anything about it. A lot of people were just saying, yeah, whatever. So I was having fun exploring and discovering. And then lo and behold, got released and I was suddenly the expert. Anyway, but that was really how it happened. And now,
Awesome. 2006.
It's interesting. It's interesting. I joined Microsoft in 2008, and working on originally, I actually joined a week before the first version went out. So I have nothing to do with the first version. You can't blame me for that. No, I'm kidding. But I remember being in a team meeting with the PM of the whole entity framework team, which was 40 people at the time. It was a fair number of people. And he said, we're not building an ORM. And that really surprised me because, when people look at it from the outside, EF is an ORM. The original EF is an ORM. I mean, that's how people use it. It's very hard to look at it and say that's not an ORM. But from an internal Microsoft perspective at that time, the reason for building it was not to build an ORM. It was to promote the entity data model as a concept that would then be adopted by the entire world, or at least Microsoft, as this common way of communicating data between applications. And EF was basically the C#.NET way to work with the EDM in your applications. And in effect, what that meant is it was an ORM, but I think the focus of the team on building this wider vision of EDM detracted from EF as a pure ORM and led it to have behaviors and API surface and things that weren't really what people wanted from an ORM, but were what needed for making entity data model work in this big vision with inside Microsoft. And it's interesting to compare that to Link to SQL, whereas Link to SQL really was an ORM. And in many respects, Diego and I always used to say that EF Core is spiritually the successor to Link to SQL, not to the original EF. Now, clearly we have, it's still called Entity Framework, and we took a lot of the naming and the API surface and all of that and made it so that people could port easily and everything. But from a conceptual level, EF Core is actually much more like Link to SQL than it is like the original EF, and being built ground up as an ORM to access data from a database as opposed to a wrapper around this entity data model. So it's kind of interesting to see how that all evolved and how we ultimately ended up actually, I think, going down a Link to SQL path, even though that, we originally, developed Entity Framework and kind of deprecated Link to SQL. The where we've ended up is basically the Link to SQL path, I think.
And it was EDM that was coming out of Microsoft research.
Yes.
Not
yes.
How to work with EDM, which was coming.
EDM was out of Microsoft research, but also a lot of research on view models and updatable view models. And so, I'm sure people remember pre-generated, pre-compiled views in classic EF, right? And that whole idea of generating these view models that were then used to update the database and query the database also came out of Microsoft research and was a big kind of underpinning of the way EF works.
Okay, let's go to, we've got, when will EF tooling support in-M scaffolding without link tables? What's the latest on own type model round tripping?
Arthur.
I think scaffolding many-to-many is in the EF Core 6 plan. We kind of overlooked that until too late at the end of EF Core 5. We should have done it as part of EF Core 5. So apologize for that. What was the other one?
Own type model round tripping.
I guess this is about scaffolding owned entities, maybe.
Yeah, we don't have any plans to scaffold owned. I mean, we don't really. The reverse engineering. Back 10 years ago or so, I remember we did research on, and we actually had some prototypes of reverse engineering where we would automatically detect, for example, inheritance and try to map inheritance. And it was kind of interesting, but you had to fit certain patterns and so basically we don't try to reverse engineer into anything really complex in terms of model structure. Many-to-many is a bit different for two reasons. One, EF6 did it, and so it kind of makes sense for EF Core to do it as well, so that people moving from one to the other don't lose that functionality. And second, because having a join table with just two columns, each of which are a foreign key to another column in a principal table, and also that forms those two columns form the composite primary key. that's a very specific type of table that we can recognize in reverse engineering and say, that's many-to-many. There's no payload. There's no other primary key. We can directly map that to a many-to-many in EF core, and you won't lose any functionality or not be able to do anything, or and so so recognizing and doing that is something we want to do. But in general, we don't have plans to really kind of try to reverse engineer any kind of patterns, and that would include own types. Like, I don't think we would try to reverse engineer into own types.
And as soon as you do this, I will do my best to add it to EF Core Power Tools before the release of EF6. So you can do
awesome.
it with EF Core 5 as well.
Sounds good.
Nice.
That's motivation for us to do it soon.
Indeed.
All right, I'm gonna skip over some questions and we will circle back, but I want to pick some and roll back and forth because some of these are really specific. But this is one I think a lot of people are curious about, the best way to handle concurrency in EF Core. I don't know why it's besides timestamps, because if we were to say that is the best way, then that restricts the answer. But what are thoughts on concurrency? I know it's a pretty broad topic.
I have thoughts, but I would like other people to talk if they don't want to dominate. Fine, then I'll talk.
Well, there's event sourcing.
First thing I would, I guess I was thinking more at the kind of low-level database, side. Like, event sourcing is certainly a way that you can get concurrent events into a stream and process them. But in terms of optimistic concurrency in the database, where you want to know whether somebody else has updated this record, and then have it fail so that you can integrate with those changes rather than just overwrite it. So the first thing I would say is a lot of people just don't bother. And I think it's a reasonable choice. And what I mean by that is last one wins is a reasonable option, I think, in a lot of cases. So in other words, if you do have two people updating a record at the same time, depending, and this is obviously very dependent on your business domain and what your application needs to do, but just consider that maybe the last one that writes the record wins, and that's the way it is. I mean, it sounds silly, but I think it's pragmatic in a lot of cases. And in fact, we see a lot of customers who do that. Now, if you do need to do optimistic concurrency, then I think timestamps is absolutely the way to do it. And whether that's a built-in SQL Server timestamp or something that you do more manually, either way.
Let's call it row version.
Row version, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, please. Thank you, Eric. So confusing. No, but I mean, I guess more largely, of course, there's the row version feature of SQL Server specifically. Again, this is a SQL Server specific feature which does it automatically for you. So it's a type that just automatically the column updates every time you update the row. But what people, I guess, frequently miss, but for good reason, is that you can also manage things yourself. So you don't have to have a database generated concurrency token. You can also manage that yourself. And coming from other databases, I'm a Postgres guy. Postgres doesn't have row version, which is, again, a SQL Server concept. It has something else. So things work a bit differently in different databases. I mean, basically find whatever the generated, the automatically generated thing or automatic updating thing is for your database. And that should be your first choice. But then there are some other options or strategies.
Right. And then, there's the whole, put it into business logic, and have a service that checks it. I mean, there's those kinds of options as well.
A higher level
kind of. It doesn't really have anything to do with Entity Framework or even the database.
So Julie, for the people who may not be familiar with the idea of event sourcing, did you want to touch on that for a second, or?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. It's not fair to just randomly throw out terms like that. So event sourcing has nothing to do with Entity Framework. It's about instead of literally changing the data in your database, all you're doing is just every time there's a change, you're just adding it to a list. Boom, 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 boom. So you can actually rebuild like everything that happened. It got inserted. This got edited. This got deleted. Oh, this got edited again. So it's just one hit at a time of the events that are happening to your data. And there's all kinds of, well, there's tooling that helps you manage all of that. And it's just a really interesting, and it kind of goes along with CQRS also. And it's just a really interesting other way of solving things. And Greg Young came up with this when he was doing a lot of work with banks, because it's so highly transactional. And so you don't have to worry about all those conflicts happening. And the other really interesting thing is you can go back in history and rebuild stuff or see when something happened. And you can have multiple databases. You can say, let's, build out, take this snapshot and send it out to a relational database so we can do some really good reporting on it. Right. So it's a really, really interesting topic, but it really is for, large, big, applications that are highly transactional and using a lot of data. You would not go to the effort of using it with something that's just small. With your album collection, remember that was always the go-to.
Be pragmatic.
Yeah. Anyway,
that does remind me, by the way, I'm just going to add, it goes very well. So for EF6, one of the things in our milestone, Mauricio is currently working on this, is the support for the SQL Server temporal tables kind of thing, which in a way connects to event sourcing or to what Julie just discussed. So basically it's about...
SQL Server works.
Sorry?
It's how SQL Server works.
Yeah. I mean, but exposing the fact that even when you apparently you look like you're mutating, a table, so you're not doing event sourcing at an application level. SQL Server still kind of maintains the entire history of things and also allows you to go back in time and see snapshots from before and all that. So that's the so-called temporal table feature, and that's one of the things on our plan for EF6.
Cool.
EF Core 6.
Okay, I had another one. While I'm pulling this one up, I had a question for Julie, since we were talking about event sourcing and larger apps. You have a Pluralsight course that's Entity Framework Core in the Enterprise, or Enterprise EF Core.
Yeah. Well, it's on my list to update as soon as Smith and I finish. We're in the middle of working on creating a new version of the Domain-Driven Design Fundamentals course. And as soon as we finish that, then I'm going to move on, because the EF in the Enterprise course, I first did it with EF4, then I updated it for EF6, and I really need to get back to it. And it'll probably, at this point, it may end up being with EF, EF Core 6. But the interesting thing about that is most of it is conceptual anyway. Right.
And that's what I was going to ask, is kind of what are the thoughts around EF Core in the enterprise versus non-enterprise? Like, is it additional considerations just for building projects at scale? And
it delves more into architecture and solving bigger problems than just the basics. So the kind of real world problems you would be running into.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So except it's like, I've got it. It's on the list. Pluralsight said, yes, you can do this. Update this one next.
Okay. So this one comes up quite a bit. We get asked this a lot. Does using repository pattern along with EF make sense?
In that course, I have a whole module, the title of which is The Great Repository Debate. And I'll say, everybody's got something to say about this. But, hey, this is an AMA with Julie, so I'm just going to start.
Sure.
First of all, here are the two answers I really do not like. Never use a repository pattern with EF, right? And you should always use a repository pattern with EF, right? So I just would like to say that. Okay, I'll let you guys add it also.
I totally agree with that. Those 2 points. It's don't over-architect. Be pragmatic. It comes down to the same thing. DB context is basically a unit of work pattern, but it effectively is kind of a combination of unit of work and repository, because the DB sets kind of act a bit like a repository. it's close enough in functionality to a repository that for a lot of applications, the DB context itself is just fine. Now, if you want to write what I would consider a real repository, and this now gets even more deep into people's opinions about what constitutes a repository. So there's a lot of like, 10 years ago, there was the generic repository is an anti-pattern going around the internet. Maybe it wasn't 10 years ago. I don't know. So in other words, if all you do is you wrap EF core context in something that exposes the same things that the EF core context does, that's not very useful. On the other hand, if you write a real repository where you have methods that are relevant to your domain, such as get me all customers which have a promotion and also have vouchers to spend or something, and you embed that as a query that your repository can handle, then that has value, or it can have value, especially in a larger application. It allows a better separation between the database query and the application domain and what it's using, such that and that would typically not return an iQueryable, it would return an IEnumerable, and basically the EF would be responsible for doing the query. So that using a repository in that way, if your application is sufficiently complex to require or to benefit from that, I think is useful and a good thing to do. But just creating a repository over the basic, this is what EF could. If you're exposing iQueryable from your repository, you're probably doing it wrong, because you're probably just basically exposing what DB context is exposing. That's my opinion.
I have maybe one more thing to add. Sorry, Julie, go ahead. It's your show.
No, go ahead, Shai, please.
One more point is about testing. So one place where repository also works nicely is if you want to mock your data access, basically. So this is the conversation that keeps coming back around in memory and how to properly test things. If what you want to do is test without an actual database, you want to mock away your database, then a repository pattern is something that can be very useful. You basically build it above your DB context and you mock this, and then you kind of cut away EF in your complete testing, which is, so you've mocked away your database, even EF core is not participating. This is the way that I believe, I think most of the team believes, is the right way to do it if you don't want to touch your production database. Having said that, I actually, again, personally do believe that as a default kind of strategy, you actually should be testing in many cases against your production database, which does raise some challenges.
Against the same kind of database as your production, not your actual production database.
Production database.
I made this mistake once already. Don't test against exactly. So test against SQL Server. Don't test against the actual production database.
Where's the show disclaimer banner? Let me pull that.
Very important. I keep making that slip of the tongue. But what we do absolutely kind of recommend against is what a lot of people seem to be looking for, is something in between. So they want something like an in-memory provider where they're still using EF core and they're still using they're using link and queries and everything, but they don't want to touch the actual database. So this is like the in the middle. It's neither here nor there. It's neither mocking your entire data access layer via a repository layer, which is great, or just going to some sort of database that is not your production database but runs the same type of database system. It's somewhere in the middle, and that's what we kind of discourage against. So a repository pattern can also be an answer to the testing conundrum.
That relates also directly to the iQueryable IEnumerable comment as well, because if you do want to mock your repository, in fact, if you want to mock anything and you're going to try and mock an iQueryable, that's very difficult, very problematic, and very fragile. Now, I've seen some libraries that allow mocking of iQueryable that I need. It's on my list of things to investigate. But still, I would definitely say it's way cleaner to return an IEnumerable from your repository. So then, like the query, the thing I mentioned before, like get me customers with tokens or something. It's easy to write a mock for that just creates a list of customers with tokens and the data you want and return it. You don't have to deal with trying to figure out what the query is and parsing the link expression tree and all that stuff, which is a nightmare. and it's both a nightmare and very easy to get wrong and fragile. Whereas if you just have an IEnumerable and you return data from that in your mock, that's a very effective way then of essentially decoupling your testing of business loss from your database, because you're entirely removing the database from that testing. You're not relying on whether the link query does the right thing or not. That's the great thing about it, right? You're just giving the business logic the data it needs to test it. The downside of that, of course, is you also do have to test that your query does the right thing, because it might not, right? I mean, we all know we've written queries and they don't do what we're supposed to do. So at that point, you'll say, well, given that I have to test the actual query as well, how much value am I getting at the unit testing at this business object level? Am I just duplicating it by also testing against a non-production but real database? And of course, your mileage is going to vary, and some things are complex enough. The business logic and the separation of teams and the organization and how you do things may make it sense to do this. But it's always worth thinking, am I actually just going to be duplicating the testing elsewhere anyway? And so it's, not worth doing.
No, I have 2 points to make. One is about the testing, first of all, which is really important to think about what it is that you're trying to test, which is kind of what Arthur was talking about, right? Whether or not you really need to, are you testing something related to your business logic that happens to touch the database? Are you testing behavior of the entity framework core, like change tracking or something like that?
Yeah.
Or are you testing to make sure that, the proper query is being executed on the database?
Yeah.
Right? I think those are really important. Then looping back to the original question, which was about using repositories. I've had a lot of interesting conversations with Steve Smith, especially as we've worked on the domain-driven design course, because we're using .NET and we're using Entity Framework for the demos. And he's a fan of repositories. So, we talk a lot about repository and generic repository, but he is pragmatic about it. And he's not like, oh, just use the same one for everything, regardless of whether it satisfies your needs or not. And he's actually created a really interesting library called a specification library. And it allows you to write a generic a repository that's generic, but it actually has logic, involved in what's generic. So it's really intelligent. So I somehow, because I was looking for something else, I closed the link to the YouTube, so paste it in, but there I'm back again. So I'll just paste that in, the repository, which is github.com or Dallas specification.ef core. So.
Yeah, and because everyone has an opinion on it, I'll share mine. I have a few points with repository. One is, don't get caught up in the pattern. You might just have a data service interface that requests certain things and has an implementation on the back end, so you don't have to follow strict repository. The 2 times I find repository can be helpful as well is, one is buffering against migrations, right? So you have that extra layer that you have that opportunity to swap out how different methods on the repository are serviced. And so you can have a stage migration because of that layer. The other is with Blazor and sharing code on the client and the server. You can actually write code that talks to an iRepository interface that on the server is serviced by EF Core and on the client is serviced by a set of web API calls. And so it simplifies and allows more code sharing. But if it's just because I want to test, I can write unit tests all day long with the DB context itself and have no issue with that. So I agree. And we are close to the top of the hour. I've got one more question to close us out. And then I think we'll wrap. It's okay if we go a little over. What are your guys' view on entities, DTO modeling? I've yet to find a benefit, usually ending up in a complete rewrite. So I think the question is, why use DTOs? Should I use DTOs? That's how I'm reading this.
Yeah, actually, DTOs came up earlier, and it made me think of, specific client, but also just so many times when I find people say, I'm using DTOs because I was told I need to, but I find that all I'm doing is writing the code to populate the to serialize and deserialize the DTOs, but the DTOs aren't buying me anything. So
Right.
that's a big red flag, right? Like, you don't have to have them, although there's certainly scenarios where they're useful, or maybe, I guess really more thinking about view models.
Yeah.
Right. Where, I'll have entities, I'll have business domain logic kind of entities. And hopefully, I can map them easily enough to the database, so I don't have to have another one on the other side. But then, I can do a query and spit stuff out to a view model, really. I mean, it depends on what you're doing. If you need to just get, if you DTO, maybe if you're sending something to a service, right, then it makes sense just to have something really simplified. But, I look for that red flag, right? Is it buying me anything, or is it just creating more work?
Yeah. Every time you add a column, how many different projects do you have to touch to propagate that through?
I think also something that we mentioned earlier, which is relevant here, is the continued ability to map different types, different shapes of entities directly to the database. So EF6 was what we used to, Andrew Peters used to say a lot, let's not focus just on anemic data models, right? Because whenever we show examples, we show a blog and post, and all it does is has, properties with getters and setters. It's anemic in the sense that it doesn't have any functionality. There's nothing built into that object that makes it a business object, right? It's just directly mapped to the properties of the database in a very simplistic manner. And so, EF6 couldn't do a whole lot around that. Like, it had some capabilities to change that mappings, but even doing things like constructors wasn't supported. Whereas EF Core, you can add constructors, you can make things read-only, you can change the shape of that thing, you can add a method to add a post to a blog instead of exposing the navigation property collection directly. So it makes it a lot easier to actually model your actual business domain in your entities with EF Core, which in turn allows, makes it less likely that you'll just want to work with this anemic data model. And the DTO is essentially the example of the anemic data model, right? I mean, that's typically what you have with DTOs, is very, very anemic, and that can be useful. I think somebody mentioned view models. Certainly, if you are going to build different kinds of models out of the data that you get from the database, so you're sending it to one view or another view, and then it's projecting into different models. That's all useful and valuable, and you can do that. But in a lot of cases, you can just write your domain objects the way you want to write them, either DDD or not DDD or whatever, and then map them with EF and use them directly. So the red flag of, hey, am I getting any value out of doing automapper or doing these DTOs or translating, is definitely something to. I totally agree with the comments made on that. And with EF Core, there's a lot more flexibility to do that than there was in the past.
Don't over-engineer.
Yeah, don't over-engineer. Should we talk about value objects?
If we could take a little extra time, I would love to address Ivan Ordonez's question. You see it's near the bottom. I always struggle so much trying to decide if it's better to use a stored procedure approach or go full EF or any kind of hybrid. So I think it was Danny Simmons who said, I mean, it's, he happened to say it to me, so I love to quote him, which is, write the simplest thing to get it working, then go look for performance or other problems, and then start adding things in. So with respect to going full EF or stored procedures, well, first of all, stored procedures are supported by EF, right? So really, it's just more the question of, are you going to let Entity Framework generate all your SQL for you, or are you going to leverage leverage your existing sprox or views or, or capability of building it better. So if you've got something new, well, first of all, I would always aim for a hybrid, right? And I think it's kind of a common idea that it probably would end up being around 80-20, where 80% of the time Entity Framework will do just a perfectly fine job, and about 20% of the time you might need to go, let me replace that with a view or a stored procedure just to make it better, whether it's a performance thing or it's just too hard to write too hard to write the query.
So totally agree with that, and I think the 2 weeks ago we had John P. Smith showing performance tuning of an EF Core app, and that's up on YouTube. So go look at that. He starts off pure EF Core, and then he adds in a stored procedure as we go through that to improve the perf of the specific query. And that's a really good approach, a really good example of what Julie is saying. Like, you start off with just EF Core, no stored procedures. And then you say, right, well, I need this query needs to be more responsive when it returns 1 million books or whatever. So you profile that, you look where the times, you look at the your query plan and things like that. And, you go add a stored procedure in pragmatically. And the session from 2 weeks ago goes into that in detail, and is a really good way to see that actually happening in reality.
Yeah, he's very meticulous.
Yeah. One additional word about this, between these two poles of stored procedures and full EF Core, there's other various mechanisms for writing your custom SQL. So if you find yourself, in need of doing custom SQL because some query is not performing well or whatever, that doesn't mean you need to automatically go to Sprox, which is the more traditional way. You can very well, just write raw SQL inside EF Core and materialize entities from this. There's computed columns. There's various mechanisms supported for not going through the traditional EF Core kind of query SQL generation. All I'm saying is basically don't jump directly into the Sprox kind of solution. There's other kinds of ways with EF Core, but also without to do this kind of thing, with various advantages and disadvantages, obviously.
I get to ask the last question of Julie, and that's, do you have any new projects coming out that you want to share, whether it's books, courses, articles? Yeah, exactly. I'm with you on that one.
Well, I've been working on Pluralsight courses. I did recently completely redo the Getting Started with EF Core for EF Core 5. Like, thanks for giving me a little breather before the next version comes out. Steve Smith and I are currently in progress of updating the Domain-Driven Design Fundamentals course, because that's 7 years old. The ideas don't change, but still for demos and things like that, it's good to update that once in a while. So I've been putting a lot in there, and then writing articles. Definitely no more books, but between how great the docs are getting, right, and John P. Smith's books, I think, are pretty good. I even wrote the foreword for his new book. But still go watch my Pluralsight courses.
Awesome.
Yeah. So that's what I'm working on.
All right. Well, I think that is going to be a wrap. Thank you so much for coming on, for your time. Thank you to the community. Lots of great questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all, but we are a very approachable team. Feel free to reach out to us over the Twitters, on GitHub, or wherever you may be, and we'll be happy to answer that.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
You guys. Thanks, everybody.
Everyone. Bye.
And I think waving goodbye at the end of a Zoom meeting is perfectly fine. It's friendly. Bye.